Good afternoon. That got your attention, didn't it? Well, welcome back to the lecture series that almost never ends. This is the third of four. We'll have one more next week. Thank you for coming. I want to introduce our guest, Herman Viola. He is a curator emeritus at the Smithsonian Institution. He received his undergraduate and master degrees from Marquette University and his Ph.D. in American History from Indiana University. Herman is a veteran of the U.S. Navy, and he began his government career as an archivist at the National Archives and Records Administration, where he founded the scholarly journal Prologue. Dr. Viola then served as director of the National Anthropological Archives at the National Museum of Natural History, where he conceived and directed two major exhibitions, Magnificent Voyagers and Seeds of Change, the topic of today's presentation. And for those of you that have been around for a while, you'll remember an exhibition we had a few years ago, The New Frontier, which Dr. Viola curated. That's the exhibit that went to Florence, Italy, before it returned and was in our museum for about 6 months. Dr. Viola is the author of numerous scholarly publications, including Diplomats in Buckskins, The Indian Legacy of Charles Byrd King, After Columbus, Exploring the West, Warriors in Uniform, and Why We Remember, which is a middle school textbook. In addition to serving as the senior advisor to the National Museum of the American Indians' effort to create a memorial on the National Mall for American Indian Veterans, he is also the historian on the Citizens Coinage Advisory Committee to the U.S. Mint, as well as a member of the World War I Centennial Commission, which makes you wonder how Herman had time to visit us today. He and his wife Susan live in Falls Church, Virginia, which is where he was yesterday morning before flying to Tulsa. Let's welcome Dr. Herman Viola to Gilcrease Museum.
You all hear me? I have a very weak voice. How's that? Can you hear me back there? Okay, perfect. Well, I'm glad to be back in Tulsa. I've been here many times. How many of you heard me speak before in your group? Oh, most of you, because you were there for the Italy exhibit, right? Well, anyhow, you're in a wonderful place. This is an amazing collection. I always tell folks this is the best Western history collection between both oceans. And I'm actually jealous that I have to get back on that airplane tonight and go back to Washington, D.C. So what we're going to do is talk about this exhibit I did, Seeds of Change. Is there a chance any of you saw that exhibit? It traveled the country for a while too. None of you? Okay. So, why am I talking about horses and tobacco when we're talking about Mexico? Well, this picture could not have existed in 1491 because Christopher Columbus brought the horse to America. He actually brought the ranching tradition to America. And ironically, he's the first European to see Indians smoking tobacco. He wrote a letter to Queen Isabella. He says, the people here have a strange tradition. They eat smoke. So anyhow, that was the beginning of the tobacco industry. But it all goes back to our friend Columbus. And as you all know, he came to America 4 times. First one, 1492. He actually came 3 more times. And the irony is that he never realized that he had found a new world, in a sense. He was looking for Asia, and he thought he reached Asia. And of course, now I work a lot with Indian people, and people always ask me afterwards in the audience, they'll say, now Herman, you're so politically correct and everything, how come you call them Indians and not Native Americans? And I say, because Indians want to be called Indians. We have the Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., but my favorite story on that is my friend George Horscapture, who was a curator for a while at the Smithsonian, but at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center too, and we became very close friends. And he was a real militant. He had been on Alcatraz Island. And, but he showed up in my office one day and became lifelong friends, and he died just a couple years ago. But I asked him that one question one time. I said, "No, George," I said, "I spend a lot of time lecturing, and people always want to know why I call Indians Indians and not Native Americans." And he says, "Well, you just tell them one thing." He said, "You know, Columbus was looking for India, and he took a wrong turn, and he ended up in South America, and so he thought, well, here, I'm in India, so these must be Indians." So we've been sticking with that name for 500 years. He said, "But we Indians are so grateful he wasn't looking for the Virgin Islands." Now, the other question, of course, is why, since Columbus found this place, isn't it called Columbus or Columbia? And again, history is so fascinating. As I said, he had been here 4 times and never realized he had found a new area that unknown to the world. And unfortunately for him, there was a man named Emeritus Vespucci, who was another Italian who liked to travel. And he came here on a voyage in I think 1501 or 1502, and he wrote a letter called Novus Mundi, which means New World. And he said right away, this is a new world. And that got circulated widely, and there was a Jesuit priest in France, Martin Waldseemüller, who made a decision to make a map of the world as it was known at that time, and he collected all the stuff that was available, and he published that map in 1507. And you're looking at this map right now, and it's very important, and you're looking at the only copy that exists today, the original copy. And the original copy is now at the Library of Congress, and it came from a castle in Germany just about 10 years ago, and another Jesuit doing research there found it. It's in separate sheets, small sheets of paper. And anyhow, it's the first map to show that there's a Pacific Ocean, and to have a separate America, because everybody thought everything was all connected at one time. They thought the world was really in 3 parts, Asia and Africa and Europe. But the key thing in the map is this frame right here. And so that's his frame for America. And because he had read Novus Mundi, he then named this new area for Americus Vespucci. And so that's why we have America today instead of Columbia. And the fascinating thing about this map done in 1507 is that how he did it, we don't know, but that is almost precisely the mileage across South America today. And yet that was all done speculatively. Okay, now, I was given the task in 1990 to come up with an exhibit for the Columbus Quincentenary at the Museum of Natural History. And I think one reason I was given the assignment is my parents came from Italy, and so the director said, "Well, good exhibit for an Italian boy, talk about Columbus." And I had no idea what to do with that story. But here was my challenge, and I said to it. So anyhow, a fellow named Hobhouse in England had written a book called Seeds of Change, and he talked about the seeds that had changed the world. And he had tobacco and grapes and things like that. He was quite into vineyards and wine. And that gave me the idea, then let's think more about this. What happened when Columbus came? And I actually put him on this advisory committee that I put together. And so we brought scholars from around the world, including England, who were specialists in what we call the Columbian Exchange, which became a field. A fellow named Crosby wrote a book on it. He was on my committee as well. And so there were about 12 or 15 people who would sit around an office at the Smithsonian talking about what would be the profound story to tell about 1492. And everyone agreed, yes, there was an exchange that occurred, and most people don't have a clue about it. The reality is, we always talk about the New World. Columbus found the New World. The reality is that there were two old worlds that came together in 1492. And that's when the New World was created. And so we said, well, what were the things that were profoundly changed because of what happened? And so we kicked all kinds of ideas around. Well, Columbus brought animals over here, and things went from America to Europe. And so we came up with 5 key seeds of change. And so one was disease, which most people don't even think about. Another one was corn. Another one was potatoes. Another one was sugar, and the other one was horse. And my committee actually wanted to put the pig down as the profound change that occurred. And I work a great deal with American Indian people, and I love horses, and I was in charge of the exhibit. And I said, we're not going to say pigs were profoundly important, and they were, because they came to the Americas. They were probably the worst species introduced. They went everywhere, dug up everything, they eat everything. They're very destructive. But I said, my Indian friends love horses, and that's what we're going to talk about. So that's how horses got in there. Now, realize now that when Columbus got here and the early Europeans got here, they had no appreciation for the culture that was here already. The Aztecs and the Incas, frankly, were the Greeks and Romans of the Americas. They had profound medical knowledge. Their medical knowledge was superior to that of Europeans at this time. And, they had a more wholesome diet. They had better foods. So here's the capital of Mexico at that time, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, Aztec Empire. Tenochtitlan was 10 times larger than the size of London at that time, 1492. We have no appreciation for the grandeur of that empire and those peoples. And so when the first Europeans found it and saw it, they couldn't believe it existed. Bernal Diaz, one of Cortez's men, later wrote his memoirs and said, it was like something that you found in the middle of heaven. Suddenly the forests opened, and here was this amazing metropolis. And the pottery and the art was so sophisticated. So here are a couple of samples I'm going to show you from the Smithsonian collections. And the one knock that they had on Indians in America is, well, if they were so smart, how come they never invented the wheel? Well, here is a pull toy from Mexico. So that was for a child to play with. They knew about the wheel. The problem for the Indians in the Americas is that they had no animals to pull wagons. There were no horses, no mules, no cows, no oxen, just people. And so, let's see, if Columbus would have dropped those horses off and gone back, they'd eventually have had wagons and everything else. The pottery is so descriptive and realistic, and a lot of these pots are real people, so it shows the medical conditions, problems they had. You can see here's a fellow who had one leg. And these are water pots, so these were things you would use in the house. That might have been Grandpa who made it to honor him. Here's another water pot, and look, this fellow has a hair lip. I mean, these are the conditions that were in existence at that time that were worldwide. Childbirth on the pottery. In fact, depending on how extreme you want to get, there's all kinds of pottery that shows everything, leaves nothing to the imagination. But this is the sexiest I'm going to get with these pots for today. But I'm sure if you go online, you can probably see stuff now on the internet. But the thing that's most astounding that most people here don't realize, I mean, I never knew it until I got into this, is that they could do brain surgery. And here they're doing this surgery without metal tools because they didn't have iron. And yet here's a pot showing a patient getting operated on. And also a lecture if you want to come down. Okay. So anyhow, here's a drawing showing a fellow being operated on. And you're going to say, oh, the pain must have been extreme. Well, not really. They had a thing called cocaine. And I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it really covered a lot of problems as far as medical pain and issues and stuff. And so you're going to ask me next, so don't bother with questions and answers, why did they even want to know how to do brain surgery? And because head injuries were very common in their society. They used clubs in warfare. And here's a pre-Columbian skull, and you can see the notch that put in the fellow's head. Probably a nice war club did that to him, gave him a severe headache. And we also have found skeletal remains in South America showing many of these people who had this procedure. And we know that it was successful because you see the feathering that occurred where they could open the head, but they did not have that metal plate you can put over there. So that person who got operated on had that soft spot for the rest of his or her life. And you know, the fact is, if it worked once, why not do it more than once? So, you know, this might have been a case where, you know, doc, I've got a headache, and he says, take an aspirin and see me in the morning and I'll open your head up and we'll get rid of that headache for you. So this person was operated on, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, and all healed. Isn't that astounding, considering, you know, we've talked about germs and all that, but the reality is that this was a germ-free, almost a germ-free environment. They did not have the common germs that we have today. And so those germs actually came in thanks to Columbus, with bringing the animals, bringing the different kind of plants, different peoples. I tend to talk too much, I don't want to go too long. So anyhow, when the Europeans came over here though, they weren't looking for medical knowledge, they were looking for gold and silver. And unfortunately for the Aztecs and for the Incas and all the other native peoples in South America, they found a tremendous amount of gold and silver. And that was what they exploited, and that's what they wanted. And so there were wonderful artworks in that gold and silver, like this one here. The sad part is that when they got these gold objects, they melted them down to make into gold and silver bars and into coins. So that's why much of that Aztec art is gone as far as the valuable stuff. And so the person who really gets credit for destroying all this is your friend Cortez. And he had heard about this vast empire that was in the hinterland. He came from what's today Cuba and to Dominican Republic. That was kind of their headquarters. And he brought his fleet over, and he made friends with a couple of Indian people. One of them is this native girl named Malinche. And so she was able to speak Nahuatl and brought him into the center of the Aztec Empire, Quetzalcoatl. And so anyhow, they thought he was a god. The Aztec people thought he was a god that had been predicted that was going to come back. And so he got entree into Tenochtitlan. But as quickly the Spaniards wore out their welcome, started taking advantage of the women, looking for gold. Where do you keep the gold? Is it hidden in this house, in that house? And so the Aztecs drove Cortez out. But unfortunately, even though he drove them out, he was driven out, he left his ally behind. Well, first of all, when they got there, they did see the marketplace. The market was described as something superior to anything you found in Europe. Gold and silver was there, all kinds of foods. But anyhow, the Aztecs drove Cortez out, and Cortez didn't go far because he had burned his ships before, so the men couldn't retreat. He had burned them so they couldn't leave. But he went out and made allies with some of the Aztec enemies, the Tlaxcalans, and he came back with 20,000 Indian soldiers to attack the Aztec Empire. But he'd already left the weapon behind that was going to destroy the empire, and that was smallpox. And so smallpox was introduced by the Spaniards, and it was really just a genocidal weapon. The Indians had no exposure, no experience with these kind of communicable diseases. And so smallpox was introduced like a rock in a pond, and the ripples went all across North and South America. And so millions of Indians died and never saw a European, never even knew what a European was, but the diseases just went from person to person to person. And their traditional ways of treating diseases was to do the sweat lodge, which of course made it worse. And so it was just a tremendous devastation to them. And they think that perhaps as many as 90% of the Indians of North and South America died as a result of the Spanish introduction. And that's why we're lucky to have any Indian people left today. It just was like Bartolomé de las Casas, who was on the Hispaniola, was the headquarters there. He was a Spanish friar, and he wrote his memoirs, and he said something like 3 million Indians died right in that area where he'd been a priest, all because of diseases. So then people say, well, couldn't this be a two-way street? Did the Indians give us any diseases? And they did give us one thing called syphilis. And so here is a syphilitic skull, and it shows the damage it does to the head. But the reality is, syphilis was not a killer disease in the Americas. What happened was, it's like these diseases now that we're finding that pop up all over. When you bring 2 or 3 strains of something together, it creates a new monster. Maybe the Zika thing is like that. Ebola. But anyhow, when it went to Europe, and it linked up with another enzyme, or whether I'm not really a doctor, but it became the killer disease once it got back overseas. And it really was a killer disease. Here's a drawing from the 1490s from Italy, and it shows a doctor treating syphilitic patients. And here's a poster from early 16th century Spain. And so it's called the disease from Naples, from Italy, because it was introduced by Columbus and his men into Italy, and then it started mushrooming out just like smallpox did in the Americas. And of course, people were trying to find a cure for it. And they thought, well, if the disease came from America, the cure has to be in America. And what you're looking at is a British print showing a doctor chopping bark off of a tree from the Americas, looking for a potion that would cure his sick patient back there. And why did they think that? Well, because they did find plants in the Americas that were really curative. They found the cinchona tree, which is what produces quinine, which takes care of malaria. And so that was an astounding discovery. So this is the cinchona bark. And so it made sense to them that there would be other plants in the Americas that could cure diseases. And the reality is there were a lot of plants in the Americas. There are something like 150 prescription drugs today based on American Indian plant knowledge. So the Indians did know a lot, but they didn't have enough to take care of things like measles and smallpox. So here's your cinchona tree. And the reality is that when Columbus arrived here, there were rainforests from coast to coast all over the Americas. And I mean, they were just fabulous, wonderful sources of animals, plants, whatever. And unfortunately, at the time that they came, they thought the plants were in the way, the trees were in the way, so they started cutting them all down. And now you know what's going on. You have, like, the tropical rainforest in Brazil, which is a treasure trove of material, is being burned at about the rate of 35 acres a minute, day and night. I don't know if any of you have ever flown over there, but I have flown in and out of Rio de Janeiro a couple times. And you fly at night, and you can see the fires in the darkness in those forests. And you know, but we now know that these forests are essential for our health, for clean air, et cetera, and yet we seem to be hopeless and helpless in trying to stop that. One of the curators at Natural History, when we did this exhibit, said burning down these forests is like burning your public library before anybody reads the books. And there's so many plants and creatures that are yet to be identified, and they're just being lost forever. Okay, so we told a story what happened through the island of Montserrat in the Caribbean. Montserrat is a teardrop of an island. It's about 30 miles from Antigua. It's only like 30 miles across. But it says everything you want to know about what Columbus did and the Spanish introduction did to the Americas. So here's Montserrat as it looked like in its heyday. I'm sad to say that shortly after we did our exhibit, the volcano on Montserrat erupted and pretty well wiped out the island. So we told a story from a village, a plantation called Galways. And I was blessed by meeting up with a professor, Lydia Pulsifer at the University of Tennessee, who had spent her life doing archaeological work on this island. At the time she was doing her work, there were the ruins of 100 sugar plantations on Montserrat. And sugar was the introduction from Columbus. You know, I think it was one of his in-laws had a sugar plantation, but they couldn't grow sugar very well in Europe. The climate wasn't right, so he brought the sugar plants with him, and sugar thrived in the Caribbean. The trouble is, it was a very destructive plant for a lot of reasons, not just because of your health, but it required open fields, so that's why you had to cut down these forests, and it required a lot of labor to make it productive. And Columbus, of course, assumed he would use the Indians as a labor force, but as we just discovered, the Indians all died. So who is going to do the work? And so the Portuguese had just about started catching slaves in Africa, and somebody put two and two together and says, let's bring those slaves to America to work the sugar plantations. And so they did do a good job of that. That's why everywhere you go now, there are black people, and it all starts with the slave industry, the sugar industry. They brought something like 10 million Africans over here, and they were very successful in making sugar very profitable. Al Crosby, Sidney Mintz, who was a sugar specialist on my committee, figured it out that it cost the life of one slave for every ton of sugar that was produced in the Americas. And so this was Galways, which is one of the plantations. And of course you had to have extreme heat to process the sugar. And that's why it was very detrimental to the health of the people who were working in the Caribbean trying to make sugar. And here was the sugar processing plant on the Galways plantation. You can see the Caribbean off to the side. It actually looks like a nice old church, but that was the sugar processing plant. But the thing that's fascinating about Montserrat is that the first indentured servants on Montserrat were not blacks, but Irishmen. Columbus found Montserrat and named it. He named it for the Jesuit monastery where he did a novena for his second trip to the Americas. But the British, the Spanish never occupied Montserrat, but the British did. In those wars of empire, they took over. And they said, what a great place to put these Irish troublemakers. And so they brought lots of Irishmen to work the fields in Montserrat. And so when I was there, it was just astounding. You hear these, because the people are black now, but they all have Irish names. They, at that time, before the volcano, they spoke with an Irish brogue. And you know, I'd ask a couple fellas, hey, what nationality are you? One guy looked at me like I was nuts. He said, Mon. He says, I'm Irish. Oh, I said, I'm glad to know that. And so the thing about it, though, is that the fife and drum are their national instruments. Their traditional dance is the Irish jig. Their national holiday is St. Patrick's Day. And it was known as the Emerald Island of the Caribbean. All of this is thanks to your friend Columbus. And then, of course, the Irish managed to get away, and the blacks came in, and they've taken over. And so now there are very few white folks. In fact, there's hardly anybody left on Montserrat now. I think about 5,000 people. So anyhow, Lydia did a lot of research, archaeological work on that plantation, and they found out all sorts of things. First of all, even this is during the period of the slavery, the treatment of the slaves was very good compared to what it was like in let's say, the United States. But so they had pottery, they had forks and spoons and plates, they had pipes, and so they smoked tobacco. They had coins, they had money, they found these in the slave quarters. These are gun flints, so these slaves had guns. And these are coins up here. But we did our exhibit in 1992, and in 1995, the Soufriere, which was the one hill that they had there, erupted. And when I was there, you could see the smoke coming up out of the ground. And I'd asked this fellows, you know, people who were helping us with doing the research, I said, aren't you afraid that there's going to be an eruption? And the one fellow says, oh, man, no. He says, that's been doing that forever. There's no danger. We have no problems. And of course, they did. And so it just blew up. And so it covered up all of that area of Galways, all the stuff that we had done all that research on, so it's all under many feet now of ash. And the capital of Montserrat was St. Patrick's, and now that's gone. And so they're trying to build a new capital on the other side of the island, but I understand there's very few people there. And it's never was a tourist attraction because the sand was black, because of the volcanic history of it. And it's very funny to walk on a beach and get black sand all over your legs. And so you can see why tourists never wanted to go there. Okay, so we've heard about disease and we've heard about sugar. Now let's talk about the horse. So Columbus on his second voyage brought about 20 horses. And he later said that horses were more valuable than gold, as far as his belief. He said the native peoples here are terrified of the horses, and they enabled the Spanish to get around very quickly. And so here's a drawing showing them how they did load those horses on those old square riggers. And of course, the conquistadors, as you know, made good use of the horses as they roamed around North and South America. And the horse really had a profound impact in Argentina, anywhere there was flatlands, the Great Plains, the Argentina and Venezuela. And you look at this drawing, which is actually a Spanish drawing from about the mid-1600s, and you look at this Indian girl, you'd swear she was a Sioux girl from the northern plains, but this is South America. You see, they don't have the bow and arrow, they have the bolo. But here are the houses, but the tents are not made out of buffalo skins, they're made out of cow skins, because the cows got brought to South America and they got loose too. So you had spotted cattle all over the place, you had horses all over the place, and the Indians adapted them to their way of life. And so this is from the Museum of Natural History. It shows Indians on horseback hunting rheas with bolos. But the horse became just a very important factor in any of the plains-type cultures. And again, here is a drawing from South America, but you'd swear it's a Catlin drawing showing the Indians before they have guns galloping across the plains. Now, in doing my research, I felt it was important to go down to South America and see about the horse industry. So I went to Argentina with another fellow. Luckily, he was a cowboy from Texas, and boy, that was lucky I brought him along. I love horses, but I'm deathly allergic to horses. In fact, when I talked to my allergist, I used to do a horseback trip leading horses, riders over the Lolo Trail where Lewis and Clark did their trail ride, you know. So I did that for about 20 years. It was about 5 days on horseback. And really wonderful, but first time I tried it, I went to my allergist and I said, you know, I got this opportunity, the Smithsonian wanted to do this trail ride. And I said, but I get so sick from horses. And he says, how many days on horseback? I said, 5. He said, I can keep you alive for a week. And, and so he gave me a steroid kit, and it worked beautifully. So anyway, I went to Argentina, and we stayed with this family. They had a huge estate, something like 5,000 cattle on it. But the gauchos, all on horseback. I mean, it is astounding to be at a place in this modern day and age where the horse is still so profoundly important. And so anyhow, they insisted I go for a ride, and this was the fellow who was going to take me around. And they don't have Western saddles like we have. And anyhow, we went, and the patron's daughter came along, and she wanted to gallop, and she was about 8 years old. And we galloped, and of course my horse dodged from an armadillo hole, and I went. Anyhow, I ended up with a broken wrist. That was my research, but it was really a fortunate incident because when I went to Buenos Aires then, and I had to get operated on and fixed, and so they have the polo industry is very big there, and I couldn't speak much any Spanish really, but they'd look at my wrist, and often the people would say, "Oh, un caballo injury? Yes, everyone, we all fell down too. Everyone showed me where they had broken something on a horse. So it made me sort of a kind of a semi-hero." But anyhow, in South America, they didn't have buffalo, but they did in North America. And that was the most numerous animal species in the world at the one time. They estimate there were 60 million buffalo, bison, that roamed across North America. And when the Indians got the horse, it sure changed their way of life. That made it so easy to get your 3 meals a day. And the horse is still extremely important to many of the plains cultures. I'm closely connected with the Crow tribe. I've been adopted into the tribe, and so I spend a lot of time going to the Crow Fair. Have you ever been, any of you been to the Crow Fair? Okay, you gotta go to the Crow Fair, 3rd weekend in August. The largest teepee encampment in North America. They have 1,000 teepees, but every Crow family has a horse or two, and it is just an amazing experience to see that. And so for Plains people, the horse is just the ultimate gift. If you want to give a present to someone, you give a horse. Or you give something that's worth a horse. And so this is a friend of mine, he's Cheyenne, and his uncle had died, and he gave his uncle's favorite horse to his uncle's best friend at a powwow. Okay, other two seeds. One is corn. Corn was found in the Americas. It was developed in the Americas. It was generated from a plant in Teosinte, they believe, in Mexico, spread throughout North America. And so the Spanish, of course, found corn. They didn't like it. But they knew it was nutritious. And so Columbus thought it was suitable for feeding animals, so they would feed it to their livestock and to their horses and stuff. But it had profound impact around the world. What it really had an impact on was Africa. They brought corn to Africa because they thought it would be something to feed slaves, something cheap, didn't cost a nickel. And the irony is that there wasn't a food plant in Africa that was like that, and so corn just mushroomed in Africa and led to a population explosion. And that was what fed the slave trade, because there were so many people being raised and growing up in the slave areas. And so here it was, the reverse thing. Our corn creates the slave industry, or certainly supplies it, to keep it coming back and forth. Here's an Aztec corn god. And so it was really, to the Indians, it was really almost like a spiritual gift. Now, for the book we did, Seeds of Change, I put this on the cover. And if any of you really want to get excited about this, you can get the book, go on abebooks.com online. That's where the publishers sell their overstock, much cheaper than Amazon. I'll bet you can get this book now for 50 cents. It set a record for sales at the Smithsonian when it came out. And so it's called Seeds of Change. This is the picture on the cover. And I thought it said everything you wanted to know about what Columbus meant to the world. Here's a picture from Nigeria. And you see one guy's wearing a baseball cap. And they're harvesting corn, which is an American product. And corn today is the most produced food item in the world. It's not the most eaten. The most eaten is wheat, and potatoes is second. But corn is used in so many ways, for making gasoline, for feeding livestock. So anyhow, it is the most, and in fact, that's the other irony of this whole story, that the Spanish were looking for gold and silver, and they found a lot. But the potato and corn harvest in 1 year is worth all the gold and silver that the Spanish ever took out of South America. But they didn't know it at the time. They were looking for gold and silver. They thought the foods were just kind of a throw-in. And then the potato. The potato was developed in South America, probably among the Peruvian Indians. And they had something like 1,200 varieties of potatoes that they developed. Now, how many do we have? 2 or 3 that people, use, but they had an immense number of varieties, domestic potatoes and wild potatoes. So this is the homeland of the potato. And so these are terraces where they would grow their crops down there in the mountains, and the terraces are still there. And this is a contemporary Peruvian farmer, and he's outside his house, and you can see here's his John Deere tractor. And this is how they dig their potatoes, harvest them, cultivate them. And they use llamas in some places to take them down from the hillside to the markets. And the potatoes then were shipped all over the world. Of course, now potatoes are grown everywhere. It's one of the most adaptable plants from the Americas. And so now potatoes are grown just about anywhere you can grow anything. And the irony is that in Peru, they are losing the potato industry, and they're actually buying potatoes now because people aren't growing them, and the market isn't there for them. But one of the places the potato went is Japan. And so here is a Buddhist priest praying at a shrine for the sweet potato. And they say that the potato came to Japan as a gift from God. We know that it came from the Portuguese, but we don't want to tell the Japanese that. And so it's a fascinating story. You can go on the street, and we buy our pretzels, you buy your sweet potatoes on the street. And here are kids outside of a potato shop. This is not Dunkin' Donuts. It's, you're getting your potato treat. So anyhow, we got an artist named Rourke Gorley to come up with an exhibit conclusion that would capture the story. So he came up with this one, which is wonderful. And it shows, it's got plate tectonics bumped in here. The plates are bumping into each other. You've got, the dog under the table. You've got all of the different foods that were found in the Americas that went overseas, and some of the foods that came, because of course coffee then comes from Europe. So there are a number of plants that came our way. It wasn't a one-way street, but ours were the most profoundly important, except for sugar, which was the most devastating plant. But what's really funny, of course, is the story about Marco Polo bringing pasta to Italy. And of course, the tomato was found in America, and they fall in love in Italy and get married. And so where would you have an Italian dinner without tomato sauce and pasta? And of course, I said my parents came from Italy. We had this all the time, never realizing that I was one day going to tell this story of how it all came together. So anyhow, that's it in a nutshell. Thank you very much. And I hope I gave you some light. Thank you.